welcome to this dialogue special Beyond Tariffs, the battle for human prosperity. As the U.S. global tariffs came into effect Wednesday, China released a white paper outlining its stance on economic and trade issues with the United States. What can we learn from the new white paper? What will be China's measures in response? And how shall we characterize the current trade ties between the two sides? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Einar Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Michele Geraci, former Under-Secretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Development of Italy, and Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean at International School of Finance of Fudan University. Welcome to Dialogue. First of all, breaking news, China has increased its tariff on U.S. goods from 34% to 84%, basically in the tit-for-tat response to the U.S. side. We'll deal with that issue later on in trying to find out how to respond, how to solve this problem. But let's start with the white paper. Professor Qian, we'll start with you. The white paper titled China's Position on the China-U.S. Economic and Trade Consultations. So share with us, what's your take of the paper?
I think it's a very reasonable and a very rational description of the development of the Chinese economy, the development of the Sino-U.S. trade relationships. It's rational in the sense that it describes China's position as the largest developing nation. Its economy is growing. It's rational because it talks about trade as a fundamental economic principle is mutually beneficial to both countries. It's also reasonable in the sense that the white paper also says it's natural that there are differences in terms of how different sides interpret the trade relationships. And finally, it's very reasonable because it says China is obviously open for dialogues, and only through dialogues these disputes can be resolved, not through one-sided irrational moves. So overall, that would be my impression about the white paper.
Michele, what's your takeaway?
I agree that is pragmatic, and I think also sends a signal to the United States to sit and negotiate. There's a mention of the Phase 1 agreement, so maybe China offers in a way to purchase more of made in USA goods to try to rebalance these trade deficits. At the same time, China just now increased tariff by 84%. And I think this white paper wants to send a signal. The problem is, I think that Trump will not read it because he is interested only in reducing the trade deficit. And he thinks that trade deficit is bad for his economy. And that's not true. Trade deficit or trade surplus are not inherently bad or good. So I think the focus should shift not on just import minus export, but on what are the underlying products. US and China are two different economies. It's normal that one buys something more from the other. It's just like companies have suppliers and customers, and they do have more inputs coming from one and more going into the other one. So I don't see a problem in trade deficit. I think that it's a wrong approach by the United States to focus too much on this.
Einar, give us a big picture or the background of this current, let's say, called stalemate or global trade war. The U.S. side has mentioned about how solving the problem of trade deficit, budget problem, debt problem in the U.S., and then they talk about non-tariff issues. So are we clear? What does the U.S. side want?
Okay, so let's start off. The U.S. has always run a deficit. Okay, let us be clear. The only time they didn't was briefly during Bill Clinton's term. So the U.S. runs a deficit because it supplies all the trade dollars, okay? And it's very advantageous in terms of taking care of its debt. It gets artificially low rates from the rest of the world because people are buying treasuries. And they're not buying them naturally, they're buying them to hold because it's easier to do that than change them into their currency and then change it back into another currency, back into dollars. So that's where things are. But somewhere along the line, the United States became convinced that it had been cheated. Now, jobs didn't disappear from the U.S. because Chinese people went over and stole them. Okay,
it's very hard to steal. Just your job.
The reality is, once somebody discovered that there's a more efficient way to make something, they go over. If their competitors don't, they lose. Yeah. They'll be out of business. So this is what happened. This was globalization. WTO, China enters in. Everyone's kind of laughing. Well, China's not creative. China, nothing much will happen except there'll be regime change. Well, regime change didn't happen. And this had a huge psychological effect on Washington. They were convinced, wait a second, you have capitalism, democracy has to follow. This is the end of history. This is Francis Fukuyama's dream, right? But it didn't happen that way, and there was this growing perception that somehow China had cheated. The fact is that when you start looking at the profits that went on, the US and Europe took 2/3 of the world's profits, although they were only a percentage of the production. Now, in terms of production, let us be clear. Production in the US has been higher every single year, okay? It just means that they do with less labor. So it's more mechanized, there's more robots involved and things like that, but the productivity is still there. The problem is the rest of the world wanted to grow, and it has. You start looking at developing countries around the world, they have been exceeding the growth rates of the developed countries.
Yes.
And now that they're doing okay, or at least see some daylight, it's unfair.
It's not fair. Well, we'll talk more about that, being fair or not fair. As we said, Professor Qian, China and the U.S., they did reach an agreement back in 2020, 2 years after the U.S. launched this trade war on China. As people know, it's a phase one economic and trade agreement. According to the white paper, the Chinese side had overcome challenges to faithfully implement the deal. Even the U.S. side issued several statements affirming the effectiveness of the Chinese efforts there. But despite the progress, despite this, I would say, the efforts from the Chinese side, China's performance of its obligation under the agreement had encountered multiple obstacles, interestingly, caused by the U.S. side. One example here is the limited U.S. production capacity hindered exports to China, because in the agreement, China agreed to purchase more from the U.S. side. The one example is in 2020, Boeing's aircraft production was only about 40% of its 2019 output, which significantly impacted deliveries to China. Is it China to blame here?
Let me, before we talk about specifics, I think there's one thing that's very important, because that agreement, again, was signed under President Trump 1.0. And as been discussed, President Trump and his team seems to be obsessed with the fact that China has a large trade surplus with the U.S., or U.S. has a very large deficit. As again mentioned by the two other guests, there are many other reasons to explain the surplus and deficit. So, if you look at that agreement, and especially if we look ahead, what's going to happen in the negotiations, if there's any sense of mutual understanding that deficit exists due to other reasons other than suspicion of one country's manipulating things, it's going to be very hard to reach agreement. I think that's very important. Now, coming back to the phase one agreement, I think indeed there are many obstacles. There's the COVID, which changed everything. In the specific example of Boeing, the general issue is that, again, President Trump and his government very much wanted to shrink the deficit. Well, again, if you want to shrink the deficit, two things should happen, right? Obviously, China needs to buy more from the U.S., which China tried. And two, the U.S. also will export more, increase, offers more to sell to China.
Right.
So in the example of Boeing, clearly, I think Chinese government had a point that we agree to buy, but if you cannot deliver, that's going to be an issue. Let me add to that. Again, in terms of, maybe this is going to happen again in the upcoming negotiation. For China to buy more from the US can also help in the sense that if China only can buy soybeans from the US, that's not going to solve the trade deficit much because you can only buy this much soybeans, and soybeans is not that expensive. If the US relax some of the restrictions on civilian use of some of these tech products, including airplanes, that's gonna help a lot, because I'm sure the Chinese side says we're willing to spend more money to buy a lot more expensive items rather than just buying soybeans. And the other thing that U.S. obviously is exporting a lot is natural gas. Again, from China's perspective, it makes a lot of sense for a very large importer of oil and gas. We cannot just rely on one source. We need to diversify, and everybody understands that. So to answer the specific question, in order to shrink the deficit, a lot of things must happen. If there's external shock that changes demand and supply on both sides, it's going to be impossible to fulfill the requirement. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, capacity is an issue. And I want to emphasize this point again. China is very much willing to buy more high-end products, and that's gonna help shrink the deficit a lot. But that cannot happen with other corporations.
But the U.S. side is restricting the export of their high-tech products. For example, the advanced chips. That's very expensive. Sure. They can reduce this trade deficit, but they're not exporting to the Chinese side. But with that in mind, Michele, another example, interestingly, from the paper, basically also, again, inadequate infrastructure has contributed to this elevated transport costs. One example out of the white paper, most U.S. ports in the Gulf of Mexico cannot directly accommodate very large crude carriers of 300,000 tons and need medium-sized oil tankers for transshipment and refueling. This results in U.S. crude oil transport costs to China tripling those from the Middle East, weakening its international price competitiveness. Basically, the U.S. oil and gas is more expensive than those from the Middle East, but somehow China has to buy?
The China does not have to buy. Remember that when there's a high cost of shipping, so tankers cost and stuff like that with insurance, this is money that even if China were to make those purchases of oil from the US, the extra cost that China pays for transport is not seen by the US custom statistics. So as far as the US is concerned, the value of export is the value of oil at the port of departure. What China pays is the value of the oil at the port of arrival, say Shenzhen. And this extra amount is cashed in by the shipping company. So even if China were to buy all this oil, as far as the US is concerned, the deficit would not change because the export of oil to China in value terms would not change. It's money that they don't receive. And this goes back, I would like to emphasize it. There is two types of deficit. There is deficit bilateral between any pairs of countries, China and the US. And this does not matter. I want to make it clear to your audience. Bilateral trade does not matter. Italy has a trade deficit with China. It is not bad for Italy. It's not good for China. The US has a trade deficit with China. It's not bad for the Chinese economy. So this does not matter. The other deficit or surplus is aggregate. So the US with the rest of the world. That deficit may be a problem for the US, but that's driven by the imbalance in the domestic economy between savings and investment. Net export is exactly the difference between saving and investment in their own country. The US has a deficit because they save little domestically, and there is no tariff, there is no agreement, there is no negotiation that can solve aggregate trade deficit. The US needs to look at its own imbalance between investment and saving to solve what may be a bit of a problem, which is the aggregate deficit, but not the bilateral. Also because, and I want to, sorry.
Are you saying that, Michele, like China is not pursuing trade surplus purposely?
No, it's just that China sells more things than and remember, it's not that US buys from China or China buys from the US. Countries, with some exception for state-owned company, countries do not buy stuff from each other. It's companies that buy stuff from each other. So when we say China buys or needs to buy more from the US, it's not like the Chinese leadership goes onto the market and purchases US goods. Right. It's up to the US to do marketing of its own product to the Chinese consumers and to the Chinese enterprises. Countries don't trade with each other. It's companies that trade with each other.
Very important point there. And of course, on a technology transfer issue to the U.S., accused China of forcible technology transfer. But all we see is TikTok, right? The forced sale of TikTok to the U.S.
Oh, that's
side.
Different. When I do it, it's different than if you do it.
So yes, and there's all of you mentioned an interesting point about the calculation of like the trade balance or imbalance, because this is something President Trump is obsessed with. According to the white paper, they calculated this trade deficit issue. The U.S. side they are focusing on the manufactured goods without the calculation of services. And in the white paper, they mentioned the three factors actually: trade in goods, trade in services, and the local sales of domestic enterprises branches in the other country. So all of them are taken into full account. If you take them into full account, and you can see the trade benefits, economic trade benefits gained by China and the U.S. are roughly balanced. Qian Jun, tell us more on that. Services, obviously the U.S. is stronger, sell more to the Chinese side.
Sure. So this is another good point, a very important point. And these are facts that all sides must accept to some extent before any meaningful negotiation can take place. So what happens is it's absolutely true that China sells more goods, products to the US, like toys, electronic devices, and so forth. But on the other hand, the US is very strong in service industry. One good example is Chinese students going to the US to pursue an undergraduate or graduate degrees, and they pay tuition in dollars. That's service industry. The US law firms, the US investment banks, these are very strong service companies globally. So what happens is if you combine the trade flows between services and goods, the actual deficit between China and the US shrunk a lot. In fact, I can add one more. In finance, we also care about capital flows. So the US investment coming to China, and they made a lot of money. Some Chinese investors firms go to the US, they can also make money. If you then add on top of the trade plus goods flows, on top of the capital gains flows, then there's no deficit. It's all balanced. So again, this is just telling you that trade, like this is the ancient economic theory that this shows comparative advantage. China has an advantage in producing at massive scale, low cost, certain goods, a lot of goods. US, on the other hand, they're very good at design, at providing services, intellectual services. And that's why if you allow trade to happen without frictions, both countries will benefit.
So this is a mutually beneficial relationship in terms of trade here, the service and the goods and all.
I'm going to disagree. Okay, let's take it. They're always talking about, and my colleagues are also, they're talking about dollar to dollar, right? Let's talk about profit. What is the profit of a law firm, of a partner who charges $2,000 per hour versus a toy maker who is making probably 3 to 4% a return? Okay, there is no comparison when if you say, oh, look, they have services. Oh, let's equate the services with the things. No, let's look at profits. All right. American companies are very profitable. American companies in China are very profitable. Coca-Cola, you name it, everything you get in your bathroom because it's coming from an American company. And they don't want to, count that. And that is very profitable stuff. So I don't agree. Now, I go back to something else. 1 in every $4 of the U.S. Is spent on something imported. If it wasn't imported from China, it would be imported from somewhere else. China is not the issue. China is just better at producing things more efficiently. Now, the U.S. used to say, oh, if you're really good and you get that insight and you're able to produce efficiently, you should be rewarded, but not anymore.
Is it possible to bring those factories back to the U.S.?
No, because even Donald Trump has a two-part plan. Drive everything back to America with these tariffs. They don't have enough time to do that. There isn't enough capital, et cetera. And then devalue the dollar by at least 30%. And this is something that Robert Lighthizer outlined 12 years ago, and Peter Navarro, he kind of went lockstep with this. But if you devalued the US dollar by 30%, how would people feel who are holding dollars for trade?
Reserve
they just
currency.
went from I had $100 and now I have the equivalent of $70. All right? It would rock the market. Interest rates, funnily enough, would go up, not down, because people would price in, all right, the risk that is associated with this. So the U.S. is under not the U.S., I should say, the Trump administration is, it's running its economic model the way an 11-year-old would. It just doesn't make any sense if you know anything about economics and trade flows and profits and anything like that. And he doesn't. So it's almost impossible, and I agree with my colleague who said, until you can sit down and talk about the same things and accept them, very hard to negotiate.
Some common sense is necessary here.
It's not common sense, it's just recognizing facts. I mean,
Okay, yes.
Or we can do the penguins. You take a choice.
10% on the island. Miguel, of course, the problem for other countries, including China, is like, how do you deal with the Trump government here? Tariffs on basically everybody else. And, some countries choose to cave in. For example, the European Union offered 0 tariffs on cars and manufactured goods. But Trump responded with, first of all, you should purchase hundreds of billions of U.S. energy. And you needed to pay the U.S. a large amount of money every year for the present and also for the past. Vietnamese offered 0 tariff on U.S. goods. But Peter Navarro said that's not enough. It's about the non-tariffs. And he listed a long list of non-tariff issues to be dealt with until they are fine with the Vietnamese side, I guess. The Chinese side, as a large economy, stands out in responding the bully with its own tariff on the U.S. goods, 84% now. What comes next?
I think I've actually met Trump a couple of times, and I know many of his advisors because I work with some of them in my government capacity and as a professor at NYU. I don't think we need to underestimate his capability to understand that he's working against the rules of economics. He knows very well that by doing this, he's not going to solve the problem of deficit. His goal really is not that. Otherwise, he would just put a tariff of 10, 15%, not 84. 84 means no trade in and out. So that's not what he wants. He's playing another game. He's playing the game of exiting all multilateral organizations in the world that for him are a pain. You have to vote, you have to discuss, agree, consensus. And he's pulling the US back on a bilateral relationship with each of the other 195 countries around the world. So all these things that we're seeing in the last few days is not really to buy more soybeans or more oil or trade deficit. It's about to say to the world, from now on, anyone that wants to do business with the US, we meet bilaterally and we agree on what to do. And what will happen is that Trump will maybe lower tariff with certain countries and not with others, for certain products and not with others, keeping in mind that he would do so for those products and for those countries where he sees there is benefit for the US economy. So if China exports to the US things that are not competing directly with the US manufacturing, maybe those products could be exempted from tariff. And the other false assumption that is not going to work is that people will reshore production into the US. That's will only happen if the world believes that these tariffs are permanent, forever. Only then you would take things out of Foxconn in Dongguan and move it back to Arizona. But if you think that this is only a game for the next few weeks, years, or months, then no one will move production to the US because they know that it's not a permanent status quo of high tariff. So it's like playing chess. If you understand that the game he's playing is not for tariff, but for other things, then of course it defeats the purpose of trying to reshore production, because no one would bring it back to the US just because he knows that tariffs are just temporary.
Einar Tangen, you're shaking your heads. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think he's playing chess. I think he's playing poker. And he's bluffing. The difficulty that Donald Trump has is that everybody knows his cards. The cards are on the table. China's cards are on the table. Everybody's cards are on the table. Yet he's trying to convince everybody that he has 4 aces, and he doesn't. And, you know, his Achilles heel here is everyone keeps talking about what's happening to these countries, right? They talk, well, this would be terrible for my country. Well, it's going to be much worse for the U.S. Take a look at the stock markets. I mean, China's went down by 5%, U.S. 15%, Japan 15%. You know, you start looking at the comparatives here, and it's very clear that the American public are going to suffer, and when they suffer, they're going to speak out, and when they speak out, 14 months from now, pressure. There'll be more
midterm
pressure.
election.
Midterm elections will send Donald Trump a new House that doesn't agree with him.
Well, Professor Chen, briefly, you know, in a certain degree, there's some, you see, oh, they are rational. For example, there's exempt of some of the Chinese export, including the rare earth minerals, metals there. They are not increasing the tariff to like 104%. What do you make of that?
So again, I think this discussion what we had is that I agree with Michele that I don't believe that President Trump doesn't know any of this. He clearly has a list of agenda. Among them, he wants certain industries to go back to the U.S. He wants to shrink deficit with some countries in certain products and so on. But the problem now, and I also agree, his strategy seems to be that throw away all the existing rules and start over. And when you start over bilaterally, that should give him maximum bargaining power. But as also the other guest said, but the problem is this is fairly transparent because everybody sees everybody's choices. So I will add another problem in the U.S.
Very
now.
briefly, 10 seconds.
The drop in stock market aside, because you know it could bounce back.
Right.
I would very much worry about the U.S.
to wait for the next time.
The Treasury prices.
And with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Qian Jun. See you next time.